Hi, I'm Reverend Emmanuel from Houston, Texas. The Netflix docuseries Tiger King is based on the life of a man called Joe Passage, who calls himself Joe Exotic. So Joe Exotic is a zoo owner who is also a polygamist, and he ran for office as an independent in 2016. So you might find yourself asking, how does a guy who owns a zoo in Oklahoma and is a polygamist get to a place where he actually runs for office? Good question. The answer to that is one word: spectacle. Joe Exotic is a showman. He was great in creating these self-aggrandizing spectacles. He crowned himself the Tiger King because he owned the most number of tigers as per his own count of things. And riding on that wave of that spectacle, he ran for office in 2016 as an independent. He even got the spotlight put on him by John Oliver in his comedy show, kind of skyrocketing him to national fame. So, what did Joe Exotic do with all this newfound national fame? What happened to him? He ended up in jail. Currently, he is serving a 22-year life sentence in a federal prison. And again, you might find yourself asking, how did a guy kind of go from there to being in jail? Good question. To understand this, we have to understand the nature of spectacle. Guy Debord is a French theorist, a political theorist, who wrote this book called The Society of Spectacle. And in the book, he says, in our modern society, people are so bored that they're looking for some form of a spectacle to entertain them, someone to put up a great show that entertains them away from their boredom. And this is where Joe Exotic enters in, right? So Guy Debord says, in a society where people value spectacle this way, they're so obsessed with the image, they're so obsessed with appearance that they end up losing their bearing with reality and truth. And in a sense, this is exactly what happens to Joe Exotic. One of his friends, later on, once Joe Exotic gets in jail, the documentary series interviews one of his friends, and one of his friends says Joe's problem started when he crowned himself as the Tiger King. He let that go to his head, and that made him kind of lose his bearing with reality. He ended up focusing so much on the spectacle and the campaign that he lost control of the zoo. And then he wanted to get his revenge over his nemesis, and in the process of doing that, he ended up hiring a hitman to try to kill his nemesis, and ultimately that's what got him on a federal charge on hire for murder, and he ended up in prison. So what we see here is kind of this classic case of someone believing in their own spectacle and allowing that to kind of drive their own life. One of Joe's co-workers says that the problem with Joe is he was always trying to be bigger than himself. His attempt at trying to crown himself the Tiger King, or being a polygamist and running for office for presidency and then running for the governor of the state of Oklahoma, all of that had to do with him wanting to be bigger than himself. So here's the question: where does that drive of wanting to be bigger than oneself come from? Donald Capps is a psychologist at Princeton. He wrote this book called The Depleted Self. The point of his book is that when people are exhibiting attention-seeking behaviors, what is behind that sense of attention-seeking is what he calls the depleted self. What he means by that is a person, when the person does not feel loved deep in their heart, unconditionally, then they have this self which feels depleted, and in order to kind of fill that sense of depletion, they try to go for attention-seeking behaviors. So the drive of attention-seeking behaviors, says Donald Capps, comes from trying to fill that inner depletion with attention and approval from other people. So, from a theological perspective, what do we see here? When I was thinking about this, I was reminded about Saint Bernard from the 12th century. He had this famous saying, Love to be unknown. Love to be unknown, which is the exact opposite of Joe Exotic and his attention-seeking behavior, which is addicted to spectacles, right? So we also have to kind of stop for a moment and think about this. Sometimes it's easy to kind of demonize Joe Exotic as someone that is attention-seeking, but we also have to remember that we all have that temptation. We live in a culture of Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, which are all attention-seeking devices that help us to find many likes and many comments and many shares and subscriptions. So we are often tempted to want to post things to create an image or to project an image that is liked by people around these social media platforms, which is a form of creating our own self-aggrandizing spectacle, right? And we ourselves have to be careful that we don't find ourselves self-destructing in our attempt to create our own self-aggrandizing spectacle. How do we do that? How do we make sure that we don't become people that are attention-seeking and we don't become addicted to our own spectacle? So, from a Christian theological perspective, I want to say two things on this. One, whatever we do, we have to perform it for an audience of one. And that's a spiritual discipline. The spiritual discipline of performing for the audience of one. And that audience of one is God. When we look at Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:3 and Colossians 3:7, he says, whatever you do it for the glory of God. Do it in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? So that's the first discipline, performing for the audience of one. The second discipline is remembering that we are the beloved of God. No matter what happens, we are the beloved of God. In John 17, when Jesus says his high priestly prayer, he says, Father, love them as you have loved me. So we are invited into this Trinitarian love of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So when we remember that we are the beloved of God, then what other people think or say about us doesn't really matter, right? So that's the space of freedom that the gospel is calling us to live in. So what's the bottom line? We live in a world of Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is always trying to make us into people that are seeking attention, trying to create these self-aggrandizing spectacles. If we were to do that, we'll be people that become addicted to the spectacle the way Joe Exotic is, and that becomes a pathway to self-destruction. And the way out of that, from a Christian perspective, is to, one, perform the discipline of performing for the audience of one. Whatever you do it for the glory of God. Two, remember you're the beloved of God. So it doesn't matter what people think about you, it doesn't matter what people say about you, you are the beloved of God. That's the gospel. That's the space of freedom that God has given us. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Anyways, until I see you in another video, goodbye. Bye.